Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C. And today I have the pleasure of talking to Wilfred McClay, a distinguished author and commentator, professor of history at the University of Oklahoma, and previously taught at the University of Tennessee. And mostly we're going to discuss his new book, Land of Hope, which is a textbook of American history. And I am especially interested in finding out how Land of Hope handles the role of religion in American history. So Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Mark, and it's an opportunity for me to say how much I love the work that you do in Washington on behalf of people of faith and trying to help the rest of the world understand us a little bit better. As you said in your intro, the Land of Hope was really designed to be a textbook for high school students. Really, I had in mind preparation for the advanced placement exam in U.S. history. And there's a longer story that I could tell another time, maybe, about how the various ways that the College Board has been changing or trying to change advanced placement testing in history had an effect in goading me into writing this thing. But in fact, I think a lot of people have felt for a long time that we needed a new and better and different kind of textbook dealing with the American past. And certainly one of the many areas of deficiency we could talk about for about 7 hours about them, but is in the treatment of religion. In the past, well, the distant past, of course, religion was given a prominent place, maybe not attentive to the diversity of religious convictions and commitments in, really from the beginning of American history, but still attentive to it. But that gradually, because the profession itself has become more and more secular, historians are not attuned to religious issues, to religion as a causative factor in history. And to the extent that they are, they really tend to see it as a proxy for other things, for material factors and the real stuff that people don't actually go out and kill other people because of the differences of religious beliefs. It has to be something else. And finally, I think for various reasons we're beginning to come back from that. The notion of the founding as a secular event begotten by deists and various forms of extremely unorthodox thinkers has, I think, been debunked to anybody who's willing to listen to the evidence. I may say, by the way, just since I have an opportunity, that Mark David Hall's book, Did America Have a Christian Founding, is just a fantastic, not exhaustive, it will not exhaust you to read it, but it's a fantastic refutation of that kind of vast oversimplification, which I even saw the other day, no less than George Will was mouthing that sort of nonsense. And people should read Mark David Hall. And what Mark does is really what I try to do in Land of Hope, and that is to neither to accord religion too much or accord it too little. But more often, I think we've erred on the side of too little, so that it comes as a shock to students, for example, to discover that the movement to abolish slavery not only was inflected by religion, it was primarily a religious movement. It was almost exclusively a religious movement. You really have to hunt around quite a bit to find secular people who are really operators, who were movers and shakers. Here and there you can, but by and large, as a movement, it was a religious movement. The civil rights movement of the post-World War II era was not an entirely religious movement, but the way it was written about up until a few years ago in textbooks really bleached the whole religious element out. You know, there just happened to be all these reverends, Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, so on. Well, there was a reason for that. And a number of people have written very good books connecting the civil rights movement to Southern Protestantism in particular. And one could go on, you know, the role of religion in the founding itself. It's neither the determining factor nor a negligible factor. So striking that balance in according religion its due, without, you know, going too far and arguing that the creation of the United States has to be seen fundamentally as a religiously motivated and religiously inflected event. That's the hard thing, and I think I try to do it. I think I do it. I think people have had a lot of feedback from people about the book, and it seems that people of faith are especially pleased by it, because I think they feel that it's much fairer to religion, and particularly Christianity, and particularly, you know, Protestant Christianity, which for most of our history has been the dominant form of religious expression. I don't go in for a secularized view of things, and I also don't go in for this sort of John Butlerizing kind of view of American religion. It's this sort of bubbling sea of all kinds of pluralism and diversity. Yes, but yeah, there are predominant trends and predominant forces, and so I try to. It's a textbook. It's a very condensed textbook. One of my biggest goals was to make it readable, something people would actually want to read. So that means leaving out a lot of detail. Some of it important detail. That was probably the hardest thing about the book.
Well, Bill, let me ask you.
The
when I left the public school system in the early 1980s, I recall the textbooks basically gave us an American history of the Puritans and the First and Second Great Awakenings, and religion seemed to stop after the Second Great Awakening. It sounds like from what you're saying, maybe the public school textbooks have gotten a little bit better since then. Is that accurate?
No, not really. I mean,
No?
I think when I say that we have come to understand better the role of religion in, say, the civil rights movement, that hasn't really filtered into the textbooks yet. It's interesting how long it takes. Sometimes that delay is good. You know, that scholarship often deals with very peripheral issues in history, and there just isn't room in a well-crafted, sculpted textbook to deal with all those things. But sometimes the delay is unconscionable, and you know, we're still getting the H.L. Mencken version of Puritanism in a lot of these textbooks. You know, joylessness, and you know, it's actually the Hawthorne version too, I guess you could say. But we're still getting a lot of that, which is unfortunate. But it just takes a lot of time for textbooks to shed those kinds of stereotypes. But I think that overall, I mean, this gets into deep waters of all the things that's wrong with professional historical writing, because there's almost nothing of which you can't say, yeah, we're studying that more, because there are so many historians being produced, so many doctoral dissertations that have to be written. So almost everything is being studied more, whether we know more about the past, whether any of that can coalesce into a larger understanding. That was probably my biggest concern in Land of Hope. I wanted people to come away with a sense of the American past that was coherent and usable to them, without being a gross oversimplification or whitewashing or otherwise an inaccurate account.
Bill, let me ask you this. It would be portrayed in secular textbooks. I think it's a narrative accepted by most Christians even, that America was a land of great piety in the past, the 19th century, but to the 20th century, it's been nothing but a spiral towards decadence and secularism. In fact, the story is much more complicated. And how do you address that in your history?
Well, I mean, one of the things I point out is that and this is part of the foregrounding of Protestantism, but in particularly Protestant evangelical modes of thought and worship, is that revivalism is an enormously powerful force in our history, and there's a rhythm to revivalism. There's a rhythm of decline and revival, of lassitude and renewed faith, and we see it repeated again and again. And I think that's a different kind of trajectory than the kind of the once pious, now kind of gone to hell trajectory, or once pious, now finally free at last, depending on your point of view. I think a more accurate rendition would include this sort of rhythm of this pulsation. It's almost like a heartbeat that goes with our revivalistic tendency. So that you mentioned the awakenings. It's hard to talk about American history and about the American future without hearing at least somebody, and even someone like Charles Murray, start talking about another awakening. Because we've had these moments in our past that when there has been an abrupt change of direction, sometimes triggered or precipitated by who knows what. And I think there's also any kind of deterministic view of history, I think, is anathema to Americans in general and to Christians in particular. We always hold out the possibility of sort of eluding the circumstantial walls that are closing in on us. That's one of the reasons I called the book Land of Hope, is that was meant to carry both a religious a cluster of religious meanings, but also the more general sense that in America, and I think this is true, this has been true, it remains true, that it's sort of a national conviction that no one should be condemned or confined to live in the conditions into which they were born. Nobody should be defined entirely by that. Of course, that can be perverted. I was assigned the male gender at birth, but I'm not going to be confined by that. Well, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about an utter sort of plasticity of human nature. But within those bounds, which are important to establish, the idea that this is a place where the fact that your father was a Mason doesn't mean you have to be a Mason. It doesn't mean you have to live in the town you were had grown up in. It almost indicates the opposite. You're expected to go off and seek your fortune. You're expected to improve on on what your parents had achieved. But it's above all this sense that there's a horizon that beckons, and that what we needn't and shouldn't be resigned to what's on the plate. And I think that's an American trait, for better or worse. It has its worst properties. We're not good at accepting limitation, even the limitations that are good for us. And I think, this one thing, as Christians and Jews both have a heritage that's very important for this kind of at times wildly libertarian culture to draw on. That liberty, thy liberty in law, as it says in America, in the patriotic song America.
You mentioned, Bill, that students are surprised when you tell them about the role of religion in the abolition movement or the civil rights movement. Supposedly, the latest generation, Generation Z, they're the least connected to organized religion of any generation. So will they have trouble comprehending what you're trying to tell them about the role of religion, or are they very open to it?
I would say that they're open in a kind of wide-mouthed way. I have a lot of affection for my students, and it's sort of an occupational hazard that you kind of forgive them more than you should. But I think in a lot of ways, the things of which they're ignorant, they can't really be blamed for that ignorance. And instead of those of us in the professoriate going around complaining about them, we should try to rectify that. So I think they're happy to be informed, happy to have their horizons expand. I have a lot of students who are very secular, and for reasons coming more out of the ambient culture, and then out of their schooling, they're very surprised. There's a whole group of us at Oklahoma on the faculty who are very strongly and openly Christian, and we've attracted some of these very bright, very skeptical, but also very open. They're kind of, I think of them as sort of Quillette people. They have that sort of sense that there's something wrong with the conventional wisdom. And I don't know whether these religious people have it or not, but they sure seem happier and more interesting than the scowling PC commissars that want to govern us. Now I see a lot of that, and I hope others do. I mean, I don't know how to. I think of elite schools. I gave a seminar at Duke this past fall, and very elite students in an elite school. I mean, these were the elite of the elite, and it was on the text was a Wall Street Journal op-ed that I wrote called "Against the Weaponization of History." And so I tried to talk about why history, the study of the past, is something that can cultivate our souls. It's not to be used as a grab bag of sort of instances that you can fling in the face of your political opponents, which is what so much of what we do. And there were a few people in the group who were really annoyed at me and made their annoyance known. I was so utterly unwoke, hopelessly unwoke. I was so unwoke I couldn't even know that I was unwoke. But there were a number of them who were really very curious, including some Asian students. There was one guy who just kept me after the seminar for the longest time. I hope he doesn't watch this, but and he clearly didn't know. It was a little bit like someone from another planet observing American society and American, very intelligent, but kind of with an almost anthropological view of us. And he was extremely interested in what I was saying, and the ways in which particularly it touched on religion. Yeah, so I again, that's not a typical. It may be not untypical of what you find in the top 10 elite schools, but it's not untypical that some of the brighter students are the ones who are getting a bit more curious about religion. They do often, and this is a problem, they often sort of say, well, if this doesn't accord with the sort of conventional wisdom about LGBT or climate change, then you're wasting your time talking to me. There's a little bit of that. but not as much as, well, at least as much as I can imagine there might be. and I think that's just going to take time. That's going to take time for people to be willing to reconsider and have the courage to reconsider, because it takes courage to stand against the conventional wisdom. And the one thing I do see overwhelmingly with my students, and I hear this from a lot of people, that in the last few years, and I really think it started about 6 years ago, I started finding it very difficult to get students to talk in class, to stick their necks out, be out of a fear that something that they say, even if it's okay today, will you still love me tomorrow? You know, will it still be politically correct tomorrow? Or will I suddenly find I've committed some horrendous sin of improper diction? And even though I meant well, you know, and so they just lay low, you know, they stay low and keep moving towards their degree, and then hope that the real world will be a little bit freer. That's terrible. That is awful. I mean, it's an utter waste of 4 years of their lives that could be some of the most stimulating years in which they're banking all kinds of thoughts and perceptions and sensations and half developed ideas and literary allusions, which they can then draw upon as the bank account matures, as they mature. They're getting none of that. And I keep thinking that at some point, you know, I mean, a lot of baby boomers like me really have come to resent the lousy sort of post-1960s educations that they got. And I think that could be a pale shadow, if there's such a thing as a pale shadow, of what could come in the days ahead. So I think I'm concerned about this. On the question of students and their religion, at Oklahoma, I have a lot of very strongly committed students, Baptists, Catholics, you know, all sorts. And I think actually the Catholics are an exception to this, but I can't get them, even in my office hours, even when they're no longer in my class, to talk about their religious life. And I don't mean delving deeply into the most intimate things. I prefer not to do that. And I kind of try to end the discussion when it goes that way. But no, I'm just talking about, where do you go to church? And fairly unchallenging, unprobing.
They see it as taboo almost to discuss.
Yeah, they've just learned it's better not to talk about. I think when they're among themselves and in safe spaces, if I may use that term, then they'll talk. They'll talk about Jesus. They'll talk in the language of the church that they don't feel free to even give a hint of. You can tell they really like it when I launch into it, and I'll say, you know, I'm talking, let's say, about John Winthrop's famous sermon aboard the Arbella, when I say, well, you know, this comes from the Sermon on the Mount, let your light so shine before men that they'll see your good works, and it'll just come rolling off my tongue, and they immediately realize that I'm one of them. I'm a professor and I'm one of them. But that doesn't embolden them. It used to, but it doesn't anymore embolden them to come to me as Christians. And so I think they're pretty browbeaten in terms of having any kind of public witness. And I saw where they're starting to throw pro-life groups off campus at Case Western Reserve. I saw this. That's the next thing, I think. that's going to happen in those few places where such organizations exist.
Bill, finally, let me ask you, your book is called Land of Hope. So you must be, by definition, I would surmise, a man of hope. So what is your hope for the future of America?
Well, I think that we will, I would definitely like to see us recover some of that piety, that sense of, I mean, my short-range hopes are rather Rod Dreher-like in the sense that I hope that churches can hang on and remain as faithful to what they are in as the flood or as the angel of death, however you want to see it, passes through us. I think we're on a road down that we're at a point where some of what's ahead we're just going to have to endure. But I hope that the faithful will remain, will stay strong, will stay hot, happy. This is un-Rod Dreher-like, happy, confident about the future, rather than a state of fear and dread. And I think the ideas and practices and habits and manners and mores that have replaced the older ways are not sustainable. They just simply aren't. And I think we should fight them where we can and lose as gracefully as we can, knowing that the loss is only temporary.
Wilfred McClay, author of Land of Hope, professor at University of Oklahoma. Thank you so much for a very, as expected, enjoyable conversation.
Oh, it's great to talk to you, Mark. It's always great to talk to you. Dear readers know what great